Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Eric Walenza.
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Eric Walenza, CEO of IoT One, the consultancy that helps companies create value from data to accelerate growth. And our guest today is Andrea Aranguren, CEO of Minehub. Minehub provides enterprise-grade digital solutions that connect buyers, sellers, and financiers within physical commodities supply chains in a digitally integrated workflow. In this talk, we discuss the need for transparency in supply chains due to pervasive supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, systematic fraud, and ESG reporting requirements. We also explored how digitalizing supply chain operations can unlock real-time visibility, highlight risks, and improve resilience of revenue and feedstock streams. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, you can email us at team@iot1.com. Finally, if you have a research, strategy, or innovation initiative that you'd like to discuss, please email me directly at erik.walenza@iot1.com. Thank you. Andrea, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this one because this is a topic that we are trying to understand better at IoT One. I think there's an interesting interplay between digitalization and sustainability, which maybe is not intuitive, but it's actually really hard to do sustainability without using a lot of digital technologies, I find, right? In terms of tracking, in terms of analyzing, in terms of reacting to data.
Absolutely. We're also at the intersection between supply chain and commodities, which is also a combination that not that many people are familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this will be a good education today from a couple perspectives. Before we get into the topic, I'd love to understand your background. It's fascinating. So you started as a VP of Commodities and Metal Logistics at Goldman Sachs. Then you were with IHS Markets. I understand you helped to set up their commodity tracker solution, and then set up or co-founded Waybridge and eventually sold Waybridge to Minehub, where you are currently today as CEO. So there seems to be a pretty clear golden thread through that. You know, what was it or when was it that you decided that your career was going to be devoted to this set of topics?
It's interesting. I actually didn't start at Goldman Sachs. Right after college, I actually worked at UBS in private wealth management. And I covered the Latin American market, and I was put in the Brazilian team. And I spent some time living in Sao Paulo, and that's really where I got a lot of exposure to commodities and specifically alternative energy and sustainability, since a lot of our high net worth individuals had derived their wealth from growing commodities-related businesses. And that's when I decided that I really wanted to transition into commodities and sustainability. So I went to business school and able to do that. And that's actually when I started at Goldman Sachs. So really developed a love for commodities actually when I was in Brazil.
Yeah, got it. And so that was back in, I guess 2009 is when you joined Goldman Sachs. Was sustainability already on top of your mind then? Or was it first commodities and eventually sustainability emerged as a topic as you understood the industry better?
It's actually a funny story. I interned at Goldman in between my first and second year at business school. And I was 100% focused on alternative energy and sustainability. And they knew that. And so as an intern, I spent time in a group that I spent most of my summer in carbon markets and looking at wind and solar energy, very, very focused on environmental markets and alternative energy. And then when I joined a year later, most of that had sort of dried up and the risk tolerance had changed within the organization. And a lot of those teams had actually become much smaller. And so I spent most of my time in oil and gas, the complete opposite of what I had planned for. So it was funny, but since then, I've spent most of my career in a variety of different physical commodities markets. I did spend some time in oil and gas, of course, in metals and non-ferrous based metals. And then, as you noted, I spent some time in environmental markets while I was at IHS Markit as well. But I've also consulted with a lot of different startups, helping them as well set up sort of their supply chains and thinking about supply chain optimization in other industries, everything from hair care to infant formula.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think normally you don't think of Goldman Sachs as necessarily a sustainability oriented company, just I'd say a very practical, financial oriented company. But I think this topic is also becoming a financial topic in many respects. Let's touch quickly on Waybridge. I mean, of course, you're CEO of Minehub today, but I think the integration of Waybridge is an important part of this story. What was the touch point or the logic behind the integration or the acquisition?
When we co-founded Waybridge back in 2019, and we set out with a mission to digitize the physical commodity supply chain. And we were finding ourselves competing more and more with Minehub. And so at the end of last year, we actually reached out in order to explore a strategic partnership. And as we started getting into detailed discussions, we realized that it made all of the sense to actually combine the two companies because there were so many synergies from a platform and a people, a customer, and a prospect perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. I feel like there's a lot more situations where that logic makes sense, right? Where you have an emerging space, you have a lot of younger companies popping up to solve the solution that end up looking fairly similar, but of course have very limited resources, right? And the logic of then joining forces makes sense, but not many, I would say, manage to actually find that point of alignment, right? People get married to their brand. There's certain things that you fall in love with when you are running a startup, and it can be hard to accept, right? Giving up your brand or giving up a leadership role. Why do you think you were able to succeed in finding, was it just the management team, you had a shared vision or kind of a cultural fit, or what was it that allowed you to actually succeed in bringing these companies together?
It's a good question. I think it was a couple different things. One, it was that I think first and foremost, it was mutually beneficial for both companies given the stage and sort of the commercial momentum and the stage of product development that they were at. MineHub was very close to signing a very large deal with a very large mining company and had a very deep partnership with Sumitomo, very strong presence in Europe and in Asia, particularly in the concentrates market. Waybridge was very, very close to signing a big deal with Codelco and had a fair amount of traction in the refined market, mostly focused on North America. And so, as you note, for startups with limited resources to actually go into new markets and to expand the capabilities of the product to be able to cover diverse markets requires significant investment. And our companies and teams and products in some ways fit together like two perfect puzzle pieces. And so, not to say that it hasn't taken hard work to sort of integrate the two teams and the two cultures and think really long and hard about our product and commercial strategy. But now that we've invested the time in doing that, we really do have a very holistic offering for both the concentrates and the refined metals market.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Makes sense. So I want to go through maybe let's say the 60-second pitch of what MineHub is doing before we go in real deep into the business. Then we can first discuss the problem around that. Let's go first into this high level value proposition. What is the goal of MineHub when it comes to helping to address the challenges related to commodity supply chains?
Sure, absolutely. We actually start that pitch with the problem. So if we think about it, the world has digitized everything that we do, whether it's in our personal lives or in pretty much every other industry. Yet the $11 trillion physical commodity market is still operating almost exclusively on paper, Excel spreadsheets, and email.
Mhm.
And the market is starting to realize that there is a massive inefficiency as you struggle to find workers to actually do the administrative work of manually entering data and reconciling in a variety of different spreadsheets. There's, of course, massive inefficiency in that, but what the market is realizing more and more, particularly in a post-COVID era, is that there's also an incredible amount of risk inherent in continuing to operate very complex global supply chains on spreadsheets and in Excel. And mistakes are more common. We're seeing increasing supply chain disruptions. We see issues with production in freight markets. And so a failure to modernize is actually creating a massive risk for the companies within the supply chain and will eventually create a competitive disadvantage if they do not digitize. And our solutions are solving these very high value challenges, supply chain resilience. More and more, we're seeing ESG compliance and emissions accounting regulations coming up in a variety of different jurisdictions. We see increasing trade regulations. We see the Inflation Reduction Act in the US mandating companies to show the provenance or origin of shipments. We see fraud, unfortunately. We've seen the Arubis fraud recently, a variety of different frauds consistently almost every quarter within the commodities market, as well as an increasing focus on data security and regulations. And so these are really the macro forces that are driving this movement towards digitization. And especially since the combination of Minehub and Weybridge, there is no other company out there providing as holistic of a trade management solution that is purposefully built for the mining and metals market. And our platform is a post-trade management platform, which is AWS hosted, so it can be accessed from any modern internet browser. So buyers and sellers within these markets, they continue to negotiate their contracts, whether they're annual contracts or spot contracts, offline. And once those contracts are confirmed, they will be entered or uploaded or automatically entered into our platform. And that sets off a series of workflows that helps both buyer and seller to manage the fulfillment of that order. And that's really where the pain and the risk comes in the commodities market, is in the actual transport and fulfillment, the lack of visibility and information that exists in the market today without a digital platform. So we bring the market that transparency, access to visibility into their shipments, into the status of their orders, and help them to manage really critical aspects of that operational workflow, such as the assay exchange, which is a very important part of the concentrate settlement process.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting when you have these massive industries that are lagging, really a decade behind in terms of technology adoption. We're doing a lot of work in real estate right now, and it's a bit the same, right? You have companies that might be managing portfolios of billions of dollars of assets, and they're doing it on Excel. And I would say that's actually easier for real estate because your assets don't move, right? At least they're stable.
That's it.
Not the case in commodities. I mean, some of the topics that you mentioned are a bit newer, right? So COVID gave everybody a bit of a slap in the face in terms of supply chain disruption. ESG is a bit of a newer topic.
Mm-hmm.
But some of these, when it comes to fraud, when it comes to just general complexity, these have been, kind of the state of the business for a long time. Why do you think there's been this delay in adoption of digital solutions in the industry, given that really the technologies existed for, I would say, a decade or so at least?
It's a really good question. I think in a lot of ways it's cultural. It's an industry that in a lot of ways is a very sort of old-fashioned industry that has been operating the same way for hundreds of years. And the demographic of the people, I mean, a lot of our customers and our main users on the platform have been at their companies for 35 years, right? And so they're sort of very entrenched in this way of doing business, which has worked for decades and didn't seem to be problematic in the past, and they could just manage. I remember actually in March of 2020 with COVID, when there were massive plant shutdowns because only one or two people actually knew anything about the incoming material, and that information lived in Manila in a piece of paper in a Manila envelope in the office that nobody could access, or in a file that was saved on somebody's desktop, and that person unfortunately got sick and couldn't access the file. And so I think COVID in a lot of ways has really opened everyone's eyes to this issue of business continuity and the risk of not centralizing data on a secure platform where it could be shared internally within teams as well as more efficiently externally. And I was an operator for a really long time. I arranged, hundreds of thousands of truckloads to be delivered to customers. And when my customer would send me a schedule, I mean, 9 out of 10 times the truck would arrive according to schedule. But the market has changed significantly because of all the supply chain disruptions. You can't just count on material arriving anymore. And so it really highlights the need for digital tools that increase visibility into where that material is, which, as you say, it certainly is moving. And both buyer and seller need to know exactly where it is because you risk plant shutdowns, which are incredibly costly.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a few topics there, and I guess these topics are important or relatively more or less important depending on geography and depending on the industry. So if I run through the key ones, there would be supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, which feels a bit more like maybe a European and maybe particularly American problem right now, fraud, probably a global problem, and then regulation related to maybe ESG, also, I guess, other topics as well, child labor, slave labor, et cetera, also topics.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that those are more general, or is it when you go into mining in the US, you talk about topic A. And if you go into Africa in oil and gas, you're talking about topic C. How do you find the resonance?
That's an interesting question. No, they're all, I would say, global topics. So perhaps on the labor shortage side, yeah, that does tend to be more of perhaps an American or European issue. But certainly as it relates to ESG and sustainability, that is certainly a global concern. I think there's a lack of clarity in terms of what that really means and what companies actually need to report and what they need to record. But we certainly are seeing an increased focus on that, I would say, in all regions throughout the world. Supply chain disruptions are certainly global. Fraud is definitely global. Huge focus on data security and business continuity. That's global as well.
Mm. And the push to adopt now solutions that provide better visibility and management, do you feel that this is coming more internally from let's say the traders themselves, or is this coming from downstream customers? Is it coming from Apple saying, we want to know where the raw materials that go into our phone are? Where do you see the strongest push for adoption today?
It's a combination. On the sustainability side, I would say the push is certainly from shareholders and customers downstream, particularly for customers that are supplying the EV industry, the electric vehicle industry. We do see that pull from customers, certainly. I would say, candidly, sustainability is a focus, and it's something that companies are really keen to understand how we can help to improve their reporting. But ultimately, what drives sales for us from a platform perspective is really mostly on the commercial side. So often we'll see C-level mandates or commercial teams that are very focused on improving their margins or the way that they do business and mitigating risk. And that tends to be who's really becomes our champion to actually sell the platform internally almost on our behalf. It's really interesting because we're not replacing another line item. We're not replacing another system. We are a completely new line item for these companies. And they're not used to buying software or this type of software in any sort of predetermined way. And so we've been most successful at finding an internal champion who's often tends to be on the commercial team to help us sort of navigate that process. And I find that it varies very much from company to company.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess the ROI calculation is interesting because there's some areas where you say, well, we get you a 20% efficiency in terms of maybe labor. Okay, that's pretty set. But then there's other areas where you can say, well, you had a fine for $90 million last year, and we could have helped you avoid that, which is a very lumpy,
Right.
It's a lumpy ROI, right? Where if you talk to somebody a month after they got that fine, they're going to be all ears, right? Tell me how I can avoid this next time.
That is right. That's true.
Cool. Well, let's talk about the platform. So, I mean, you've already given us a good high level overview, but break it down. Maybe actually let's start with the users. So you already touched quickly on who the champion is. Is this something that's going to be used by one team? Is it going to be that it's owned by one team, but then there's, 8 different teams in the organization, everybody from finance to the guys that are, the drivers of trucks that are going to be logging in? Or what does the user landscape look like?
The user landscape is evolving. So we use what we call a phased implementation approach. So we'll start deploying the platform initially with the operations teams, often procurement teams or the sales team. So it's a combination of the commercial and the operations teams in order to capture all of the contracts. We help them to really collaborate with their supply chain, whether they're a buyer or seller, to facilitate everything from confirming monthly quotas, which are constantly changing, to managing delivery schedules and providing updates to the schedule. We work really hard to understand where all the shipments are coming from, and we'll actually connect to the source of every shipment, whether it's a warehouse or we're connecting to a trucking carrier or a shipping line or to the supplier themselves. And we will automate the vast majority of all the shipment data in the platform. And we capture really critical facts. So not just, the typical bill of lading number and maybe the weight, but actually the brand and the specifications of the material on that shipment. And that unlocks a huge amount of capabilities from a reporting and analytics perspective. We also help both buyer and seller to manage all of the shipping documents. So a huge pain in this market is managing all of the shipping documents. Metals is notorious for having a huge amount of paper and way too many emails. So we streamline and automate that process. We centralize all of the digital shipping documents and associate them with the shipment and the order So take away a lot of the reconciliation work that has to get down to even understand, this supplier owed me 1,000 metric tons this month. How much has actually been delivered? How much is in transit? How much is left? That simple calculus is very hard to determine often. And so we take all of that reconciliation and manual work out of the process and completely digitize and streamline the entire operational workflow in order to fulfill an actual order in the market. And then once we get that foundation down, we often expand within the user set to other areas within the organization. So once we have a critical mass of data on the platform for a particular company, we often start engaging with their sustainability offices, as we can now provide comprehensive reporting around transportation emissions, around traceability and source of data. We help customers to calculate percentage of sustainable sourcing and a number of other factors to verify compliance with different regulations. You mentioned child labor and other human rights regulations. And then we'll also open up, depending on whether our customer is a manufacturer or a producer. In the case of manufacturers, we'll often expand to the actual workers at the plant. We'll be using the platform because it provides them with the much needed visibility to their incoming shipments, so they can know what they can expect to receive and when, and more specifically, the actual chemistry of the material, so that they can plan better from a smelting perspective at the manufacturing facility.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, one of the pains that at least I've encountered before working with clients in this in supply chain areas is that data input still requires human effort in many areas. I mean, there's some areas certainly where IoT solutions could do this, but a lot of supply chains just don't have the sensors in place to provide that data. And so you're kind of requiring somebody to at some point say, this arrived and I'm going to open up the app and I'm going to put the data in. Otherwise you have a dark point in your map. So what does that look like? Or do you take an active role in helping people to fill these? I mean, you mentioned in the manufacturing space, but I guess in logistics also, there's a lot of cases where there might be more of a blue collar worker, and that data input from that person is very important to providing the visibility.
100%. And that's where we've really created a competitive advantage. 90% of all data in our platform is automatically created. So we work very, very hard to eliminate any manual data entry. And that 10% tends to be, the entry of trades that are annual trades that get entered once a year, or very low volume vessel shipments may be entered manually creating one or two shipments a month. But in the vast majority of cases, that's what we've had to get really good at, is automating data in a variety of different formats from a variety of different sources. So at this point, whether we're connecting to a customer's ERP system directly, whether we work with them to create automated reports that come to us via email as a CSV or Excel format, whether we're getting a structured email that's in the same format every time from a trucking company, whether we're receiving exports of data from the rail line or from the warehouse itself, or even from the manufacturer, we can automate data in pretty much any format, which to precisely avoid that need for manual entry.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So it's that kind of job of saying, okay, there's 300 different ways that people share data, and we just have to kind of figure out the reliable way to ingest that data, regardless what format it's, which channel it's shared through.
And it's not just the formats, but it's actually also very, very difficult to match data. The way that sellers refer to a shipment is actually not the same the way they refer to a shipment that they receive. And so sometimes we'll see a shipment that went out, another shipment that went in, and it's actually difficult to determine that it's the same shipment. So we've done a lot of work on data mapping as well to make sure that we can actually map data, because the market refers to the same thing, whether it's a shipment identifier or even the material itself, in so many different ways. And there's really a lack of standardization in how the market communicates with each other. And that, in fact, is one aspect of our goal, is helping to standardize the way that buyers and sellers manage their trades to really drive operational efficiencies.
Yeah, interesting. So GPT came out about a year ago, and I suppose that is a tool that's well designed for handling situations where you have kind of messy communication, right? Where people are using similar but not exactly precise terms to talk about the same thing and to make sense of that. Have you found ways to integrate this generative AI into your solution, or are you working primarily with rules-based and then trying to build standards into your customers' processes?
We're starting to look more and more at AI in a variety of different ways. So, one is to actually improve the productivity of our own employees. So, our
Mm.
engineers use AI related tools to help in the actual writing of the code and helping to enhance their output. We also use AI in some of our sales and marketing activities to help internally with that as well. And then we recently launched a new tool, which we call enhanced ETAs. Because we have a tremendous amount of shipment data, we've created a proprietary data science model where we can understand what the route that a shipment is trying to take, and we can actually create our own ETA or predict when that shipment is going to arrive. We find
Mm.
that tracking is very, very difficult. And so, even though we have a very comprehensive network of visibility partners and we're connected to a very large number of logistics partners, even if we have GPS connections to a truck, sometimes it fails, the truck driver turns it off. And so it's actually really difficult to get even above 90% tracking accuracy on the platform, which is why we've invested in building this machine learning data science based algorithm in order to enhance the tracking and the visibility that we provide customers. So that's an
Mm.
example. We're just getting started. It's definitely a huge growth area and a huge opportunity to leverage all of the really exciting technology coming out in the AI space.
Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. So you could say the sensor says that the product hasn't moved, but the truck just cleared a document somewhere. So we think it probably is actually moving. And yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay, cool. There's another technology that's been around for a while with a value proposition on supply chain visibility. I'm curious if you think that there's anything here or not. So that's blockchain. And companies have been kind of talking about how this can help provide visibility in supply chain for a while. I have yet to host anybody on the podcast that really has a legitimate solution there. Do you think this is really a useful technology for this field, or more like a technology in search of a problem?
I think we've seen a lot more examples of failures related to blockchain than successes. That being said, I think a lot of those failures are based on people expecting blockchain to solve underlying problems. Not some magical box that's just going to solve the problem of the data within it. But I do think there's some
Mm.
use cases. We do write, particularly for our asset exchange functionality, because it is incredibly highly sensitive and very commercial. It's an issue of trustless data. We write aspects of the data to the blockchain
Mm.
for immutability and data security. I don't think that it's sort of necessary or something that needs to be utilized, probably, I would say, in the vast majority of cases. But there are some situations with highly sensitive data where customers just, they do feel much more comfortable if aspects of that most sensitive data is written to the blockchain and they feel like it's immutable and it can't change. Even though, as technologists, we know that we can build very secure infrastructures that have auditability and permissions and controls and uphold the highest standards that relate to data security. A lot of this is about perception, and particularly in this market, change management is so important that providing that additional comfort in certain situations, I think, is justified.
Mm. Yeah, it's a good way to think about it. So it's better thought about as a particular type of infrastructure that you can use to support your solution in very specific areas, as opposed to a solution itself, which I think is what a lot of companies try to say. We are a blockchain company that does X. And then in the end, maybe a lot of what they're doing actually doesn't require blockchain. It's just, it becomes a bit more of a branding.
Exactly. Yeah. And it becomes complex from a coding perspective to
Mm.
develop and maintain, and it becomes much more costly from an infrastructure perspective as well, often.
Yeah, great. So talk to me a bit about some of the challenges when it comes to bringing customers on board the platform. So clearly there's a lot of drivers right now that are incentivizing companies to figure out supply chain visibility, whether it's from a cost perspective, a regulatory compliance perspective. I think there's also still in this traditional customer base challenges for adoption. What tend to be the big challenges, and then how do you address those and try to smooth the process for adoption?
We actually touched on some of those, right? So
Mm.
One of them is difficulties with tracking. So
Mhm.
the market often, and you mentioned this as well, the lack of sophistication in terms of the tech architecture, what's even available, right? So we could connect into any system. I mean, IoT or GPS. I mean, particularly in markets like in Latin America or in some of the more undeveloped regions, it's actually very difficult to get GPS tracking on trucks in an automated way. And so I think tracking is very, very difficult. And it's also one of the biggest problems we're trying to solve, which is in providing increased visibility into the material flows. And we're limited by the tech architecture of our partners, whether they be logistics partners or even warehouses. We're dealing with one warehouse, which is a very important warehouse that brings in more than 50% of the copper into the US. And they still operate on clipboards and paper and scan handwritten bills of lading to their customers. And so it's still, in a lot of ways, a pretty unsophisticated supply chain from a tech architecture perspective, and that certainly creates challenges. The other aspect, which we touched on, is change management. There's still, I think, even though there are certainly macro forces and tailwinds helping to drive digitization, it's still a process. And companies they have operated the same way for decades or even hundreds of years sometimes. And so that change management challenge is certainly real. I think that when you start talking about operational efficiency, people get worried about their jobs and there's resistance from a variety of different sort of user groups at times. I think the other thing which we talked about, which is actually a huge challenge, is that justifying the cost. So we're not replacing an existing line item, but we're actually creating a new cost for the company. And so it becomes very, very critical to be able to justify the value from a dollar perspective that we're going to be delivering. And as you correctly pointed out, we can certainly calculate operational efficiency gains or gains from a working capital perspective, gains in getting paid sooner and what that looks like in terms of financing cost savings. But probably the biggest saving is in avoided fraud or in major issues. And those are hard to calculate and hard to justify sometimes from a company perspective because, like, well, it may happen, it may not happen, right? And so the actual budgeting and process of securing budget to purchase the software is still a process that we're navigating.
Yeah. Yeah. Understood. So what would that look like if we look at a typical rollout? I mean, you've already shared kind of who the champion is and who the users are. But if we look at it from because you have to justify the cost, I guess you start small with a specific team, you maybe do a pilot or you do a couple modules and then you ramp up. What would be the timelines? How many people would you be starting with? I don't know. Maybe we don't need to get into budget, but if you can give kind of a high level indication of, what would be a starting cost for somebody that wanted to give us a little bit of a look at what would it look like for somebody to start using the technology today?
Our typical implementations have become much, much quicker. So we've actually invested in internal tooling and we've now can benefit from a very large network and ecosystem so that every new customer implementation is much, much more seamless. We are in the process of implementing with a company as complex and global as Codelco, and we're managing 100% of the refined copper sales globally. And they are set up with their initial customer set, which represents about 50% of their business in 30 days. And I think that's really representative of where we are from an implementation perspective. And so their commercial teams are engaged from a contract entry and booking perspective. Their operations teams are engaged as it relates to anything having to do with logistics. And we've already done counterparty outreach and had initial conversations, are in the process of getting all of their customers connected to the platform. And it's been 30 days. So we can actually implement very, very quickly. And we don't tend to start too small. I really don't like pilots. Minehub, I know traditionally did a lot of pilots. I really don't. I think it's very hard for a pilot to be successful. I think you really see the value of the platform when you have sort of substantial business on the platform and you can really see the value of all the reporting and the analytics. We have some really innovative predictive tooling on the inventory side that becomes really impactful once you have all of your suppliers or your customers connected to the platform, as an example. And so what we do tend to do is we do start with a subset of our customers' businesses, whether it's one region like the US or one commodity like refined copper. And then we'll start implementing with their most important customers and then eventually add everybody in their network. And then often what we look to do is to expand to additional materials or to additional regions with that customer.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. This is an interesting point about pilots. I do feel like the IoT industry is a little bit addicted to pilots because maybe it's a way to show success, or it's a way to get a bunch of customer logos, and say we're working with these 100 customers. But yeah, I agree. It's very hard then to point to any real tangible impact, because you look at it and you say, well, okay, maybe the technology seems to succeed, but does it impact our business? Who knows, right? After it's been deployed. And often maybe the technology doesn't succeed, or the problems in terms of actually using the technology at scale are very different from the problems when it's a pilot with 3 users, right? So there's actually not a direct comparison to those two deployments.
That's right. I think it's a big mistake to try to validate, does the technology work? I think the question you should be asking is this a product that has product market fit? Can I show a repeatable sales process by which multiple companies are willing to pay for this product and continue to pay for it because it's transforming the way that they do business?
Yeah, makes sense. Great. Well, let's talk about the future. So, I mean, this is still a relatively young field, and you're also a relatively young company. So I imagine that, 12 months looks like quite a long time, right, in terms of your technology roadmap and market development. So if we look out over the next 12 to 24 months, what's exciting for you in terms of the company and maybe also in terms of the broader ecosystem?
Absolutely. In the short to medium term, we are incredibly focused on ensuring that our customers are happy and ensuring that the Codelco, as well as Sumitomo, and we recently signed a very large mining company that would like to keep their name confidential. But we are very, very focused on ensuring that those implementations with market leaders that we worked for a very long time to secure those deals and to get not their business, but their partnership, really. We want to make sure that that is incredibly successful and that we can bring on their business and deliver optimal value. But looking a little bit further out, we see the platform we built as an incredible foundation for future growth from a product perspective. So one is growth into adjacent commodities. Right now, we've been very, very focused on mining metals, most specifically within copper and aluminum markets, because those are the markets where we've seen the most traction. But we're very keen to expand into adjacent markets. We're looking at steel and chemicals, agriculture, potentially lithium, and some other physical commodities markets that suffer from a lot of the same pain that we see in copper and aluminum, and could certainly benefit from a digital platform such as the Minehub platform. And then from another perspective, we also see the platform as a really incredible foundation to overlay additional services and features. So that same visibility that we provide to buyers and sellers is really attractive to banks that are financing the transaction. So we're in conversations with banks to see how we can help them to mitigate risk from a trade finance perspective as they finance commodities transactions. And then, you brought it up, sustainability is I think is a huge growth area, and particularly where we sit in the supply chain, where we have a robust offering for both the bulk concentrates market as well as the refined copper market. We're incredibly well positioned from a traceability and a chain of custody perspective. We also have all of the critical shipment data, so we know exactly where every shipment came from, all of the key sort of criteria for every shipment. We can easily pull in carbon intensity and transportation emissions. And I alluded to it earlier in our conversation, but I think the market is still evolving and defining what their requirements are as it relates to sustainability. And I think there'll be a huge opportunity for growth there once the market's ready, and we'll be well positioned.
Yeah. There's another set of stakeholders I can imagine giving you a call at some point, which would be the IHS market or Goldman Sachs, and saying, hey, you have a lot of interesting data that we'd like to have a look at. Do you see any possibility in the future for any type of data monetization, or is that just too tricky given the confidentiality issues?
Way too tricky. I get that question a lot. We had to work so hard to get companies and traders comfortable with putting their most sensitive data on the platform that I think it's going to be a very long time until the market is comfortable with us actually sharing or selling that data.
Yeah. No, I see a lot of companies working on technology solutions to anonymize and say we only sell certain metadata and da-da-da. But I think end of the day, it's a trust issue, right? And it's very, very complex.
It's also very hard to anonymize a lot of that data because you have very large consumers in one area. If you're talking about a very large aluminum flow in Davenport, pretty obvious who it is. So I think it's actually very difficult to anonymize data in a lot of cases, even on an aggregated basis, even on a global scale, just because you have so many sort of concentrated activity from certain market leaders in certain regions.
Yeah, makes sense. Great. Andrea, anything we didn't touch on yet that's important for folks to understand?
We're just incredibly excited to be at this inflection point. Both Weybridge and Minehub invested a huge amount of time and effort in getting to the point that we are, and we have really excited about the partnerships that we've secured, about the team that we've put together through the integration and through the acquisition. Really spent a lot of time investing in coming together as one company and one team, and I think there's a lot of work to do, but we have an incredible team of engineers and product people and commercial people, an incredible network of customers that are really supporting our success. And so I just feel very fortunate to be here at this time.
Yeah, great. Well, it sounds like you're on the right path. Wish you lots of success in the future. And thanks, Andrea, for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. If you have unique insight or a project deployment story to share, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. Write us at eric.walenza@IoT1.com.